In an era where accurate and interoperable map data is crucial for everything from navigation to urban planning, the Overture Maps Foundation is leading the charge. This isn't just about cool tech. It's about aligning efforts, solving shared challenges, and yes, still doing the hard work of keeping data clean, current, and community driven. We'll hear from Marc Prioleau, Executive Director of Overture, and get the inside scoop from Esri Canada's Paul Heersink and Arif Rafiq on why this work matters, especially when it comes to addressing data challenges and advancing transportation solutions. Let's get started. Welcome back to Geographical Thinking. I'm Michelle Brake, and I'll be your guide as we explore ideas, stories, and conversations through the lens of geography. Today, I'm joined by three guests, so let's get started with their intros. Joining me today first is Marc Prioleau. Marc, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, thanks, Michelle. I'm Marc Prioleau. I am the Executive Director of Overture Maps and have been in that role for about 2 years. Overture was started about 2.5 years ago. Before that, I worked for Facebook, or Meta, changed in between, and was part of the team that put it together, that put Overture together. And actually, Esri was a pretty key member of that and an early joiner and adopter of that. So I've worked in geospatial for longer than I care to admit. I think about 20 years, which has seen an interesting change, and a lot of has evolved in that time frame.
Fantastic. Thanks for that. Moving on, we'll go to the Esri Canada side, starting with Paul Heersink. Paul, tell us a little bit about yourself and why are you here today?
Hi, Michelle, and thanks for having me on the podcast. I'm the program manager for Esri Canada's Roads and Addresses program for the last couple of years, and I've also been involved with Overture as the lead for the addressing task force.
Fantastic. And rounding out our group today is Arif. Arif, how's it going? What brings you here today? What are you going to share with us?
Oh, it's going great, Michelle. Thanks. I think I was just pulled off the street to participate in this podcast. So thanks for having me, Michelle. My name is Arif Rafiq. I'm the transportation industry manager here at Esri Canada. I've been in this role now almost 9 years. And what this role means is that I support our transportation initiatives for Esri across the country, whether that would be helping provincial ministries of transportation manage their road network or cities and transit agencies and logistics organizations, all sorts of fun stuff. I've been in the transport industry probably about 16, 17 years. Prior to Esri, I was working as a director for the International Road Federation in Washington. And before then, I was an engineer implementing asset management systems in most of the US DOTs south of the border.
Wow. So a great range of experience here across the board with different data types, different data sets. I want to say thank you for joining me today, Marc, Paul, and Arif. Welcome to Geographical Thinking. Let's get into it a little bit deeper. To get us started, what is Overture Maps Foundation and how do each of your roles intersect with it? Marc, let's start with you.
Sure. So I'm the executive director, and so my role intersects rather heavily with it. But Overture was started really around the idea of building open map data that could be used by anyone to build ultimately the map they need for whatever their application is. And there were several parts of that. One of the parts was that there are many, many sources of data. And as we go through, especially now, you think about AI, but in open data, there's community source data like OpenStreetMap. There's government data that is becoming more and more prevalent. There's increasing corporate open data. There's more and more AI generated data. And so one of the thoughts was to bring all that data together and do the hard work of conflating and managing the quality of that. And then the other big piece is to make that interoperable with other types of data, because as you know, spatial has just had this explosion of rich data, but being able to conflate that and attach it to the right parts of the map is increasingly hard. And so that whole concept of interoperability was a key part in the forming and since what we've done since. We started with 4 companies. Esri was number 5. They joined almost immediately after. And now we're at about 40 companies. So we range from some of the biggest companies in the world like Meta or Microsoft to 10-person companies as well. And it's a collaboration that has really been a lot of fun to be a part of.
Fantastic. That's a lot of growth over the time that you've been with the group. And Seeing such broad integration with other industries and other companies is pretty inspiring.
It's
Now,
been a lot of fun. And one of the things that we hope is the more companies we have with different perspectives, the better our solutions will be. You can't count on any one company to know all the applications, but by building that community, we really benefit from kind of the combined knowledge.
okay, kind of a it takes a village to raise a map situation.
Yeah, that sounds like a good T-shirt. Maybe we need to do.
Hey, you never know. Maybe next year. Moving us along, Paul, how does your role intersect with the work that Overture Maps does?
Yeah, so like I mentioned when I introduced myself, program manager for the Roads and Addresses program. So obviously, I'm involved with the addressing part of Overture and being the chairperson there. But I've also, prior to my role as program manager for Roads and Addresses, I managed the Community Maps program at Esri Canada. And there, it's a similar situation as to what Overture is doing, although on a bit of a smaller scale, where we're taking hundreds of different data sources, putting them all together, standardizing them, and producing something that the user can use in a standardized way. So some of that experience has been very helpful in working with all of the different data sets that we're looking at with Overture.
Awesome. And very key work getting data standardized, sharing it with us. I know we always benefit from it both internally and externally. That takes us to Arif. Arif, how does your role intersect with the work that Overture Maps is doing?
Well, first, I'd like to say I'm a big fan, not just of you, Mark, but of Overture. Um, I love the mission of the openness of the platform and the data that's provided, particularly for transportation. Transportation infrastructure that all of us use on a regular basis, whether that's a road, a highway, a path, trail, rail. I mean, that's infrastructure that is meant for the public, and it's typically funded by taxpayer dollars. And so the data that represents that infrastructure also should be public and open. And I don't know, I mean, over my time here in transport, I've been noticing a bit of a risk when it comes to the ownership of that data. And I personally believe that it should not be privately owned, that should be open. And so when I learned about Overture Maps, I thought, wow, this is a really, really powerful endeavor that is happening here, because we're creating a transportation network that is usable by all. And as I joined it, I thought that's a great mission that I'd like to attach myself to. And then I also learned a lot about what Overture does, and then I started drawing the parallels. And I'm sure we'll talk about this a little bit more, but there's a very strong how do I say this? There's a very strong intent from transportation owners or transport authorities out there to manage transportation data effectively. And so I'm involved because I want to help align transport authorities' intent of managing that data to the public intent. And as Overture Maps is an open data source, is designed to be used by all, the way that that data is formatted is critical for the purposes of a transport authority. A transport authority has lots of business needs. And in order to make those business needs a reality, I think Overture Maps has a strong position to be able to deliver that. And I like being involved to make sure that I can support that.
Fantastic. And I think together, the three of you provide a great authority to speak on data, what's happening around the world. How do we intersect in different ways that maybe we see or even don't notice necessarily around us? This takes us into our next question. I'm wondering, Mark, with Overture aiming to align global mapping efforts, how do you see standardization benefiting GIS professionals and organizations on the ground?
Great question. The one of the things that we see is that GIS remains hard, and a lot of the reason it remains hard is because of getting access to the data and then getting it in a place where you can actually start to do something useful for it, whether it's use it in a map or use it in an analysis. And I think that one of the things when we founded Overture that we really felt, and in some of the early conversations, the people who started it recognized that we were all doing a lot of work which really wasn't terribly value added. It didn't contribute to their business model or anything like that. And we were all doing it redundantly. And so there was this huge waste or tax on the industry. And I think that was one of the things around Overture. So just to give you a couple examples, right now, data exists, but it's split up and all over the place. And so pulling it together, even if you're not creating any new data, is a tremendous benefit. And for instance, Paul's team's been working on address data. And I mean, that's squirreled away all over the world in different places and pulling it together. The second thing, as Arif says, putting it in a format that's consistent, well thought out, is another big thing that helps. And then the third thing that we saw is whether the data is open or not, companies want to join data to that. If it's an address or a building or a place or a road segment, they want to join data to that. And there's no good way of doing that really without being a geospatial expert. And so to expand the market, one of the things we think a lot about is how do we build an open base layer, but then how do we let anyone attach data to that, whether that's traffic information, tax information to an address, reviews to a place. How do we let people join that in a consistent, uniform way? So those are some of the things that we're trying to do to hopefully take some of the friction out of the market.
Fantastic. And now, Paul and Arif, from your viewpoint, how does participation in Overture benefit our users and partners who rely on authoritative data? Arif, let's start with you.
Oh, me first this time. Okay. I see this from two perspectives. I can look at this from the perspective of the transport authority who needs to deliver or share their authoritative information. And I can also look at this from the perspective of a transport authority who maybe perhaps doesn't have a lot of information and wants to consume information from Overture Maps. And if you think about the prior, a transport authority that manages its own representation of the infrastructure, for the most part, they do an excellent job. And they do that for the purposes of not just one business case. Like, let's say, navigation and routing is a very common business case that many people use transport networks for. But they're also in charge of managing that data for things like life cycle cost analysis. How do we make sure that infrastructure lives as long as possible? For safety analysis, how do we make sure that it's safe for its users? They also want to do things like traffic analysis and vegetation management and all sorts of things. The list goes on and on and on. Oh, and of course, emergency responders. There's so many different roles that the transport authority needs to manage. And the businesses that are in charge of those roles are varied. And so transport authorities have ways to manage that data effectively for all of these different purposes. But can some of that data be shared with the public? Of course it can. So I think the benefit here is when a road authority or transport authority makes a change, they change a four-way intersection to a roundabout. How can they ensure that the public knows about that before it actually happens? So they're well prepared for that. I think Overture Maps is a fantastic mechanism to be able to share that information. And then there's the other folks, the folks that maybe aren't staffed up enough to be able to have a proper authoritative representation of their infrastructure. Are they able to tap into Overture Maps to use that as their authoritative representation? Of course they are. I think, but they also need to be able to consider the same business cases that I talked about earlier. That same road authority that may not have the staffing, the GIS staffing to be able to manage that data, they still have emergency responders. They also have asset management needs and vegetation needs. And so that transportation infrastructure that comes from Overture Maps needs to meet those business cases. So I think participation in Overture can benefit both of those environments. And I see a huge potential.
Fantastic. And now off to Paul's side of things. Paul, where do you see this benefiting our users and partners?
Yeah, definitely. I'm going to take a perspective of data user, for instance. There's a lot of open data sources out there that are available. Anybody can go and download those data and use that data, provided the license meets their requirements. But Overture actually takes all that data, puts it all into one single data layer, data source, and standardized it. And there's a lot of work in doing that standardization. I mean, anybody who has worked with multiple data sources that they want to incorporate into one mapping project has to spend a lot of time cleaning up that data to make sure that what we're looking at is the same for all those data sources. So the work that the Overture team is doing is standardizing it and checking it for quality and updating on a regular basis. We include looking out for duplicates in the data, which happens sometimes, and removing some obvious errors and completing the attribution. So take, for example, addresses. You get a city that provides an address. They might just provide the street name and the street number, and they might not even include the city name because they don't think it's necessary because it's local data. But of course, we're looking at it from an international perspective. We need to have all that content completed. So we take the work and do that on behalf of the user and publish it so that what the user is getting is actually a better data source than they would if they downloaded all these different data sources and put them together into a single database. And as well, having a database that has a persistent and unique ID for every feature enables users to rely on the data as a stable source to which they can connect their own value-added data to.
Can I just add one other thing that I think is another important piece? And if you think about how mapping has evolved, one of the big turning points, I think, was about a dozen years ago when maps and spatial data got pushed out to phones and then could collect information back. And one of the things that's been happening for a decade in the industry is feedback from those endpoints, those sensors, has been brought into the map to build and update and correct the map as it goes. And so if you think about that transition, map data building has gone from building by survey to building by sensors. And what that means is we've gone from an environment where the best map was built by the company with the best survey team to the best map is built by the map that has the most distribution, that has the most sensors. And so one of the things that we think is a natural benefit is by combining people around a common open shared asset, you grow the number of endpoints, which grows the amount of feedback, which ultimately, and this is a bit aspirational, we haven't quite gotten there, ultimately should build the best map. And I think that's an important part of the promise of Overture. And as we build it and get more use, building that flywheel is an important part of what we're trying to do.
Yeah, and I appreciate that call out of kind of where we've gone to where we are now. Technology is rapidly changing.
And the other part is, companies, as Arif was saying, organizations, think about city transit agencies, have distribution problems. They're trying to get their data out to citizens. And so they can take that and they can make it open, but that data has to go into the hands of citizens. And if that can go into the apps citizens are using, so much better. That all of a sudden that becomes a very practical thing. So that idea of distribution, both for utility of the data, but also to collect feedback, is, I think, an important part of what we were thinking when we started Overture.
Mm-hmm. No, and it definitely shows, I think, within how much you've grown over time. We're going to get into kind of how big things are currently, but I do want to take us into, I think, a bit that builds on this further. Arif, how might standardized data models like those that Overture is working on, or data structure concepts like linear referencing, improve transportation agency participation?
I think quite a bit. Um, Standardization is something that, of course, is extremely important for this type of mission. Absolutely. We talked about it already. But this is linear data we're talking about. And I think when most folks think about standardization or a data model, they think about the way that data is described. Is it red? Is it blue? Is it 45 centimeters high? Like, all the attribution of a particular piece of data is commonly known. And so standardization sometimes gets aligned to that aspect of it. How do we standardize those data fields so that person A and person B know that they're looking at the same thing, or they can compare apples to apples? And that's absolutely relevant. What adds another dimension or another facet to this discussion, though, is because we're talking about linear transportation data, we're also talking about linear segmentation of that information. And that is a tougher nut to crack. Standardization, when it comes down to linear assets, is difficult. And it becomes plainly visible when you talk about the various business units that I was talking about earlier. A routing and navigation segmentation of linear infrastructure is done one way. Portions of lines are structured slightly differently than portions of lines for the business need of things like asset management. A practical application of that is, well, when you're driving somewhere and you have to make a right turn, well, that little right turn lane might only be 50 or 60 meters long. It's very unlikely that a city is going to do a paving project for just that right turn lane. They're going to do a paving project which spans hundreds of meters long. And so the way they manage their data in terms of the linear segmentation is very different. And so how can we approach a place where standardization can coexist with those multiple business models? It's definitely a challenging one. But that's something that I think, as Marc put it earlier, is aspirational, but I think we can approach a way that it definitely becomes possible. For linear information, it's necessary to deal with this. And I think Overture is on the right path to getting there.
Fantastic. Thank you for that. And going back to that Overture side of where things are, Marc, how does Overture ensure collaboration while balancing different contributors' interests and workflows?
Yeah, ensure is a strong word, but it's certainly the goal of what we're trying to do. And as you said, Overture has grown. We're now just under 40 organizations. They range from large national mapping agencies, large corporations, down to the smallest startups. And we're also doing an increasingly complex project. I mean, as Paul said, we're building 6 data themes: addresses, buildings, roads, places, admin boundaries. But there's probably 20 themes we could be building, so it could get more complex. One of the things we think about in it's an interesting organization because it's, in some ways, people are there voluntarily. They volunteer to be there because they believe in the mission, they believe in what's happening. One of the we've got about 120 engineers that are working at some level on various projects on about a dozen teams. And so it makes it difficult to keep coordinated. One of the things we try and do is a concept that's been talked about a lot, which is highly aligned and loosely coupled. So in other words, we try and align the project around goals and where we want to be and milestones and things we want to do at the top level, and then be loosely coupled so that the various teams can kind of decide on their own what to do to get to that. And part of that is we formed sort of essentially a management team, a team of leads. So for instance, Paul leads the address task force. He has a number of other colleagues who lead other task forces, and that becomes sort of the management team. And that's a team where we drive for alignment. And then we hope those leads will drive towards those goals in their own way, in their own projects. And it works well. It's not perfect, as no human organization is perfect. One of the other things I was just going to say is we really benefit from different people bringing different perspectives. And I'll point to Arif, who came and did a presentation to the entire group on linear referencing and transportation. And here you have one of the most knowledgeable people on that subject talking to a bunch of smart people who don't know anything about linear referencing, or maybe know a little. And so that's an example of the shared wisdom that comes from this group. So.
Fantastic. Thank you for that. Calling out Paul for his work within one of those task force. I'm wondering, Paul, here at Esri Canada, your role as program manager for roads and addresses, what steps are we at Esri Canada taking to help align best practices with global mapping standards through this type of collaboration?
As many of your listeners probably know, especially those in the municipal sector, we here in North America are already moving to a single standardized data approach with regards to roads and addresses. And that's simply because of the requirements of NG 911 in both Canada and the US. And some of those standards are also happening elsewhere in the world, although probably in a bit of a different way. But what we'd like to do eventually is to get a lot of our customers, many of them who are providing data to the Community Maps program, on board with Overture as well, because they are authoritative data providers. And having them in Overture will ensure that their own authoritative data becomes part of this quality worldwide database. We haven't done that yet. There are licenses to reviews and customers to talk to before we can get there, but I'm convinced that many of our Community Maps participants will definitely be part of that if they're up for it.
Fantastic. And acknowledging that all of the challenges of data can't be fixed overnight, as much as we would love a magic wand for that. How do we ensure the critical work of maintaining and sharing and validating data is still being prioritized? Paul, do you want to start with this one?
Yeah, I think definitely data quality and validation is really important to Overture. We're not just going to be throwing anything into our database just to sort of complete the picture. We want authoritative data that is of high quality. And we want our users to come and trust that the data coming out of Overture is a quality source of data. So running a number of quality checks and just verifying that data to ensure that the quality is there is really important to what we do.
Okay. And then, Mark, how do you see things from your side for ensuring that maintaining and sharing and validating is prioritized?
It is, as Paul said, a high priority. And it's interesting because in the time context, we had to put the data together first. And now, especially in the last 6-9 months, we've started to focus on how do we maintain the quality of it. And the first part is, how do you measure the quality of it? How do you understand what the quality is? How do you benchmark? And a lot of the teams are doing a lot of work on that. And establishing benchmarks. Then the other part, and Paul touched on this too, is upgrading the data. When we started, we tried to build from large data sets that gave us coverage, but now we're at a place where we can start to go in. And as Paul said, the Esri Community Maps program is a great place for people with very high quality data to put it in and then get it into Overture. And so, I think that's another big piece that we're now beginning to look at. And then ultimately, I think this idea of sensor-based feedback becomes a very valuable thing. And I think what we can do, and we're talking to people about this, is by putting this data in the hands of like literally billions of users. If you look at the membership and literally billions of users, now you get feedback on where maybe the data has become stale or old or needs to be checked. And our goal is to flow that back to the owner. So if you're a municipality, we'd like to flow that signal back to the authoritative source and as a way of saying maybe this is where we need to look at upgrading our map data. And I think that's something that those sources haven't had, is that return of how their data is being used and what signal we're getting from it.
Gotcha. And Arif, to round us out here, any thoughts on how are we ensuring that maintaining, sharing, and validation of data?
In the past decade or so, the amount of transportation data that's become available has absolutely exploded. There was once upon a time, I think many of us on the who are here may remember, that if you wanted to find directions or look at a map, you pull out a little map book in your car and you figure out where to go, and that was the source of how to navigate. Things have changed, right? It's not just about from the consumer perspective about what's available out there in terms of options, but in terms of data providers. There are thousands. Every day, I feel like there's a new data provider out there. And you might even get down to the granularity that every vehicle out there, connected or not, has now become a sensor in a way. So I think the answer, at least my perspective on this, is transparency. I like the idea that, Mark, you were talking about earlier, that there's going to be a lot of sensors out there, and fusing them together so that we can get a wide variety of eyes and people to be able to validate and critique that information is important, because with more data you do get better results. But I think it's also important to acknowledge where the data is coming from. People who are looking at that data should know that, oh, this comes from the authority, although it may not be perfectly up to date. This one's coming from a satellite feed, which is updated every 20 minutes, but maybe not all that authoritative. So I think when you present that information with all the metadata, people can come to their own conclusions about the validity of the information that they're being presented with.
Fantastic. And I think that helps to paint that picture of what's really needed in the world. And or if I think even making sure we check, who are we getting this data from? Is it the authoritative source? Are we checking? So I think that provides a lot of color to our landscape here with data. Mark, I'm wondering what's next for Overture for the next few years, and how will that shape partnerships with organizations like Esri?
I think a really interesting time for Overture, because when we started, you have to kind of do things in a sequence, and the first thing in the sequence was to get the fundamental data layers out and get them, with as good coverage as we could get, as good quality. But once you get that, it allows you to focus on a lot of, I think, the real promise of this partnership and kind of making it happen. So I think, there are a couple different things. I mean, one we talked a little bit about is this concept of assigning stable IDs to the entity as a way of aiding conflation, and figuring out what those stable IDs should be is a big thing. And next month we'll be talking a lot more about the pieces of that. Another thing that is, I think, we're the place to get is an area, sort of a specialization, because so far we've been working on broad-based things, all the addresses, all the road segments, all the places, all the buildings. But now that I hesitate to say done, because any mapping person will say you're never done. But now that we have that foundation, now actually I think there's a lot of opportunity for specialization. So municipalities that want to work on variable transit information can kind of partner together and develop a specialized solution. People who want to work on digital twins or indoor maps can partner and develop specialized solutions from that. And so I think as I look ahead, I think one of the exciting things is specialization, which also allows companies to join on a more specialized basis. They may not care about mapping writ large, but they might care a lot about indoor maps or something like that. And then the other part that I'm excited about are, although we've done well, there are sectors we're not well represented in. I think the whole global development, crisis, humanitarian, environmental part. We have a few members, but I'd love to see more. I'd love to see more representation from time zones between India and Korea, and things like that. So I think there's growth. Let me hit the last thing, because I think Esri is really an interesting example. Esri to me has always been so interesting because as a company, Esri touches so many users of map data. And I think one of the benefits for us of having Esri as a close partner is getting feedback, their feedback, which really aggregates a lot of feedback, and also their voice out to those customers in describing what we're doing, talking about it. And so Esri's really been a great partner in this. And we leverage it. I mean, Esri's been very helpful in helping us talk to people in different sectors to understand their needs, and that's really been invaluable.
Fantastic. And I think that's a really exciting time to be in, where you've already established yourself so well as an organization, but from here, it's a world to grow into. I'm looking forward to seeing more what happens in the next few
There
years.
is so much more to do here. I mean, it's really fun, and I think we put some markers down to show what we can do, but I think I think the next 2 years are going to be much more interesting than the first, and I think the first two were pretty good. So
Okay, so maybe in 2 years we'll do a what's happened since. Fantastic. That brings us to our last question. We always like to leave our listeners with some way that they could get involved or align their interests more with our guests. So, if someone in the GIS community wants to get involved or align their work with Overture's direction, what are the first steps they should take? Arif, let's start with you.
Okay, I'm gonna pull on that specialization thread that you just talked about, Mark, because I think if that is indeed true and we're ready to specialize for a GIS department, for a transport authority, I think the first question or the first step they need to take is understand, what is important to them. And to be very specific, the data that is being used in that particular business within that particular organization has a specific need. I used the example earlier about paving versus transit versus navigation. Those are all specializations that I think the Overture Maps Foundation or the data layer can support. But in order to achieve that level of specialization, we need to find out what's needed. And so I think for a GIS technician or a group is to sit down and understand what is it that they truly want out of a map layer or a business use case to use mapping for. And that's a tough thing to do because often these folks are, day after day doing the same thing over and over again. And the easy answer is, well, just I want exactly what I have today. And that's a difficult one to deal with. So I think it's going to take some effort to peel back those layers to find out what the people using the data are going to need. And I think that would be the very first step, is understanding that.
And Paul, that takes us to you. Any thoughts or feelings you want to leave people with on how they can get involved or align their work?
Yeah, I think there's actually a couple of really easy ways of doing this to get involved. And one of them is just to start taking a look at the Overture data, find out what's in Overture. It is open data. You can download it. You can go to the Overture website. There's a couple of links on there that point you to where to download data. There's also a map viewer there that you can start to take a look at inspecting the data. Try to incorporate that data into your everyday work and see how that fits in. And also, if you've got your own data, let's say address data, for instance, take a look at your address data and compare it to what we have in Overture and see where you might be able to help us improve the content there. So that's one easy way that you can do in the comfort of your own office.
Fantastic. And that takes us to Marc, the head of the whole organization here.
No, I mean, Paul and Arif made great points. I mean, the easiest thing is use the data, and just to highlight Paul's team. Paul's team has pulled together almost 200 sources of open address data, put it together, put it in the same schema, put it on the cloud storage, and give it away for free. So, like I don't know, like tell me why you're not using that. So look at that. I mean, that's that, and we've done the same with buildings. We've got 2.4 billion buildings. We've got a global road network that has been normalized and sectioned. So I think the data, first and foremost, use the data, because I firmly believe that the more people use the data, the better we will be. Second thing is, if you have data that maybe isn't open data, but you want to be associated with that, watch this space. We've been talking about this thing called the Global Entity Reference System, or GERS. Next month, there's going to be a lot more information, not just on what it is, but how you would implement it. And so if you're a data supplier or you're a data owner, whether it's open data or proprietary data, look at that and seriously consider doing it. And then the last one, just to tap on what Arif said, is the reason to be involved in Overture is because you probably know your specialized use case better than anyone else. At least you think you do. And if you don't, one of two things will happen. One, your specialized use case won't get dealt with because no one on the team deals with it, or it might get dealt with by someone else in a way that you don't think is optimized. And so really one of the reasons, someone the other day on social media said, I hope Overture takes on, I think it was parking. And my response was, you have two options. You can hope someone takes on parking, or you can get involved and do it yourself. And that's what, I think the main reason to be involved is to be sure that your use case, and increasingly your specialized use case, is really well represented. We will be better if we have experts developing this stuff. And otherwise it won't get developed, or it'll get developed by someone who's not an expert. Neither of those are our goal.
Fair. I think those are wise words for us to leave on as well. That brings us to the end of our episode. Thank you again for all three of you for joining us today. Any last words you want to leave our audience with?
No, but thank you very much for the time. And thank you, Paul and Arif, thank you for being on. And thank you, Esri. I mean, Esri's been, as I mentioned, a great partner that probably for me started 4 years before we started Overture. I mean, we had a long partnership there, and it's really been a great partner for us.
Fantastic. Now, map lovers and data dreamers, that's a wrap on today's journey. From global collaboration to open data innovation, we've seen how Overture is redrawing the boundaries of what's possible in digital mapping. A big thank you again to our guests and to you, our listeners, for tuning in. If your head's spinning with ideas or just new appreciation for open data, be sure to check out overturemaps.org and dive deeper. Until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep thinking geographically.